Good evening and welcome to this book study we have every Wednesday night at 7 here at New Covenant House. As part of our weekly routine, we think it's important to have structure in your life, and this is one of the ways that we do that. The book we're reading is Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christianopoulos, which started out as his doctoral thesis, and the purpose is to kind of synthesize all the writings about Christian anarchism in one place, and that's what the book is about. I have the abridged version, and I also have the Kindle version, which is the full version, but you can download the first chapter, which is about the Sermon on the Mount, which is kind of a manifesto for Christian anarchism. And we've been working on, there are 5 or 6, maybe more, about half a dozen points in the Sermon on the Mount that are dealt with in this book. And we went through the first one very detailed about what was that again? Yeah, and resist not evil, not to resist evil. And sorry for the technical glitch here. And he made about 5 points in that. And now we're coming to another point, which is to love your enemies. Another one of the major points in the Sermon on the Mount. And there are kind of two points within that. The first point is that and it's kind of an extension of the resist not evil concept, that when you meet evil with evil, you end up with this vicious cycle, and the same thing is happening when you hate your enemy. And the other point that he's making is that loving your enemy is kind of like a litmus test for Christianity, for being Christian. It's not easy to love your enemy, and but that's what he's commanding us to do. So the passage in the Bible that talks about loving your enemy is this. Jesus saying, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain and dust and just and on the he sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans do the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans do that? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. And that last point, I'll talk more about that, is made by Yoder. Yoder is one of the writers that Christianopoulos is just examining, and he's the one who has a good definition of what it means to be perfect as your Father is perfect. Let's just clear up a couple of definitions. First, number one is neighbor. We have to define who neighbor is. And the other thing is we have to define who the enemy is. And Tolstoy is the one who kind of defines that. And he's clearly talking about condemnation of patriotism, that we are better than you. We are set apart, so you don't count as much as we do. And that is, in a way, hating your enemy. But first, let's look at what he says is the neighbor. He says, Tolstoy then realized, however, that neighbor in the Jewish tongue simply means a Jew. So we know that the Jews have been set apart by God to be a holy nation. That doesn't mean that they can kind of like lord it over the other nations or regard them as less than themselves. But that's what a neighbor means. It's another Jew. And that kind of like makes me think a little bit. Does that kind of like contradict what Jesus is trying to say here? Because it kind of like encourages you to identify with a nation or a tribe or what have you. But I think what he's trying to say is that it is okay to identify with one group as long as you don't think that you're better than them, than the others. So that's, I think, what he means when he says the neighbor means another Jew when Jesus is talking here. So the other word that needs to be defined is enemy. And Tolstoy says, the word enemy is seldom used in the Gospels in a private or personal sense, but almost always in the public and national one. So it's not personal. The Bible is not talking about personally hating another person. It's all about nations or nationalities. And that's what I've been trying to limit myself to saying all along here, that the Jews are a holy nation. They're set apart. Doesn't mean they're better than others. Everyone else is still created in the image of God, and they have to be treated like the image of God. So that seems to be the consensus among these anarchist writers, that Jesus is talking about people, not persons. So Tolstoy concludes that what Jesus is, all the scripture mentions of is where the Jews are prescribed to oppress, slay, and destroy other nations. Jesus boils that down to just one sentence and says, "Thou shalt hate or do evil to thine enemy." So that's what the Old Testament is saying. But Jesus says, "You've been told to love your own people and to hate the enemy of your race. But I tell you to love all without distinction of nationality." And I think that's what I just said, that even the enemy is created in the image of God, and they need to be treated as God. So Tolstoy says, Jesus simply tells us to love people of other nations as well as our own countrymen. So it's easy enough to love the people who are like us ourselves. It's difficult to do it with other people who are different from us. And Tolstoy talks about a snare that arises from the false belief that one's good is bound up with the good of one's countrymen, and not as it is really with the good of all men on earth. So, we're not depending on just our own nation. We are really interdependent with everyone else on earth. And I think the people who are talking about climate change and all those disasters that are happening, and it's evidence of that. So he goes on, "Yet, if the new rule is to make no difference between our own and other nations, then this rule also requires, quote, never to act in conformity with such a difference, that is, never to provoke or take part in war, and to treat all men of what nationality soever as though they belong to our own." And that's Tolstoy talking in the book named What I Believe, which is a very readable and good book. And I encourage you all to get a hold of it. And there's actually audio versions of it on YouTube, and you can listen to it whenever you want. So Tolstoy is saying that Jesus is ultimately outlawing patriotism. And I think the illustration of that is the Good Samaritan. You maybe remember this story about the person who was attacked by robbers and left to die, and one holy man after another passed by and just didn't do anything until the Samaritan, who took him to an inn and had paid for the innkeeper to take care of him until he could return. And the significance is that Samaritans are the enemy. They are hated by the Jews, and probably the opposite is also the case. And at one point, Jesus goes out of his way to talk to not only a Samaritan person, but a Samaritan woman at a well, and that was definitely a no-no in the eyes of the Jews. So, yeah, that is the illustration of what it means to love your enemy. And Tolstoy concludes that whenever the state stirs up patriotism and national preferences, it is thereby disobeying yet another of Jesus' instructions. So maybe we should leave that part of it. The other part that Christianopoulos is making here is that loving your enemy is a litmus test for being a Christian. So it is easy enough to love your fellow from your own nation, people who are like you. It is far more difficult to love people who are different from yourself. So he says, love of enemies might be very difficult, but that only makes it an even more revealing criterion to identify genuine followers of Jesus. According to Shelsiki, remember he was the guy who was writing in, I think, the 13th century or so, even before the Reformation. The whole test of a Christian comes to this. Is he willing to love his enemies? And Wink, who's one of these other writers, says that this is the litmus test of authentic Christian faith in a book called Jesus, the Third Way. And then we come to this definition of what it means to be perfect, as God is perfect, by Yoder. Yoder is another writer. I think it's in the book called The Political Axioms of the Sermon on the Mount. Or maybe it's in the Politics of Jesus. Both are good books. They're a little hard to read, but you can do it. Yoder says, we are asked to resemble God just as this one point, not in his omnipotence or his eternity or his impeccability, but simply in the undiscriminating or unconditional character of his love. This is not a fruit of long growth and maturity. It is not inconceivable or impossible. We can do it tomorrow if we believe. We can stop loving only the lovable, lending only to the reliable, giving only to the grateful. As soon as we are grasped by the unconditionality of the benevolence of God. There must be no limit to our goodness, as your Heavenly Father's goodness knows no bound. So that's what he's saying is, as soon as we grasp and are grasped by the unconditionality of the benevolence of God. So that's what it means to be perfect, as God, your Father in heaven, is perfect. So he continues, as Yoder again, the perfection to which Jesus calls his hearers is not a flawlessness or impeccability, but precisely the refusal to discriminate between friend and enemy, the in and the out, the good and the evil. It is easy to love our friends. What Jesus taught and lived, however, was to love and forgive both the good and the evil, just as God does. So that was the litmus test of being a Christian. A couple of other points that I want to pull out here is that love of enemies opens the possibility of reconciliation. So if you hate your enemy, there is just no way that you're going to be able to reconcile with him. And I shouldn't say with him, because in this sense, in this context, the enemy is the enemy nation, not the enemy individual. So, and this is, let me see, I'm not sure who says this. I think this is a good point too. The real enemy is not any human person or group, but rather enmity itself. To overcome the vicious circle, enmity must be dried up in the heart by cultivating love. In the long run, by such love, enmity will be overcome. Love your enemy, and you will have none. We talked about before the cycle of violence. Here again we see that love overcomes this cycle of hate. And Christianopoulos now concludes here. This state, and I forgot to mention that previously, well, I kind of did in the sense that Tolstoy concludes that Jesus prohibits nationalism. So, in other words, the state is responsible for the wars, and we talked about before that if you murder somebody, you're going to be punished for it. But if the state does it in a war, then it's okay. So that's why we need to get rid of the state. So Christianopoulos says, the state, however, does none of that. It treats its nationals differently to foreigners. It stirs up patriotism, prepares for war and goes to war. It discriminates between good and evil domestically. It institutionalizes love of friends and hatred of enemies. It does not even try to pretend to mirror God's unconditional love for all. For Christian anarchists, therefore, on this account as well, the state is an unchristian institution. So yeah, the state is by definition evil and needs to be abolished. So that was a bit long today, but there was a lot of information in this little chapter here. Next week we are going to move on to another point in the Sermon on the Mount which Jesus is making, is called swear not at all. So yeah, next week on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. we will be here again and look at Jesus' command not to swear. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week.